energy should always be a bottleneck for any industry, and this is a new industry that's growing incredibly fast. As you know, AI is both a technology that's going to revolutionize many applications, and we're talking about some of them here. But the AI industry itself, the manufacturing of the artificial intelligence takes energy. It takes energy, it takes AI factories. It's exactly the reason why.
In June 2026, Reuters published a headline calling Nvidia the world's largest company. That same week, Jensen Huang, the man who spent 3 decades turning Nvidia from a graphics chip startup into the machine the AI era runs on, was closing a deal with a power company. The deal was called Helix. The partners were KKR, one of the largest private investment firms on the planet, Nvidia, and a company called Vistra Energy. Vistra runs power plants, the kind of infrastructure that was supposed to be the old economy, not the new one. Together, they committed over $10 billion to a single structure, AI computing facilities. Bundled with direct access to the power generation those facilities need to function. A chip company, a Wall Street firm, and a company that runs power plants. You could read that as Nvidia expanding its reach, and you wouldn't be wrong. But I kept returning to something Jensen Huang said over a year earlier on a May 2025 earnings call. He said, AI is essential infrastructure, just like electricity and the internet. He meant it as a statement about permanence, about the depth of AI's role in modern life. What he did not say, what I don't think anyone in that room had fully worked through, is that the comparison was also a dependency. AI is essential infrastructure, and it runs on electricity. The analogy turned out to be a prophecy. To understand how that happened, how the most valuable company in the world ended up in business with a power plant operator, you have to go back to the decision that set all of this in motion. A success, one that worked exactly as designed, right up until it didn't.
Well, putting CUDA on GeForce, that was a strategic decision that was very, very hard to do because it cost the company enormous amounts of our profits, and we couldn't afford it at the time. But we did it anyways because we wanted to be a computing company. A computing company has a computing architecture. A computing architecture has to be compatible across all of them.
In 2006, Nvidia made a decision that had nothing obvious to do with electricity. The company had built its business selling graphics processors, the chips that render images in video games, fast, parallel, good at doing many calculations simultaneously. In that year, Nvidia released something called CUDA, a software layer that let scientists and researchers use those same chips for problems that had nothing to do with gaming, climate modeling, drug discovery, fluid dynamics, physics simulations. The scientific community found uses for GPU computing that no one in the games industry had imagined, and Nvidia, which had built a tool for one purpose, discovered it had built a tool for almost any purpose that required massive parallel computation. What Huang bet on was the generality of the hardware, that a chip designed to render shadows and reflections in milliseconds could be repurposed with the right software layer into something closer to a general scientific instrument. That bet paid off. Across nearly 2 decades, it compounded into the AI infrastructure boom that made Nvidia the world's most valuable company. It also set a physical trajectory that no one, including I think Nvidia, fully priced in. Here is what that trajectory looks like in practice. An early H100, Nvidia's flagship AI chip of the mid-2020s, draws enough power to run several high-end computers simultaneously, continuously, every hour it operates. Now take a full rack of Nvidia's current generation hardware, not a single chip, a rack of them, the kind deployed in the AI data centers that Nvidia's customers are building right now. That rack requires close to 120 kilowatts of electricity. In early 2024, when Nvidia unveiled its Blackwell architecture, the company announced it could deliver generative AI at up to 25 times less cost and energy consumption than its predecessor. That is a genuine engineering achievement. The kind of thing that should, in theory, reduce the electricity problem. Better chips doing the same work for less power. And here is where the story becomes something stranger than an engineering story. In 1865, a British economist named William Stanley Jevons was working in Manchester, watching the industrial economy around him, and noticed something that didn't make sense. Steam engines had become dramatically more efficient. They burned less coal to do the same work. Every economist, every industrialist, assumed this would reduce coal consumption. Instead, coal consumption exploded. The reason? Efficiency didn't reduce demand. It reduced the cost of using coal. And when something becomes cheaper to use, people use more of it. The total consumption grew faster than the efficiency gains could offset. Jevons wrote it down. He called it the coal question. We call it the Jevons paradox. The efficiency was real, the relief was not. Nvidia's chips get better, the cost per unit of AI computation drops. The major cloud providers pass those savings to customers or reinvest them in expanded capacity. Either way, the demand for AI computation grows faster than the efficiency gains offset, because cheaper computation isn't less computation. It's more computation that used to be uneconomical and is now worth running. Jensen Huang has a name for what Nvidia's customers are building. He calls them AI factories. Manufacturing at industrial scale. The word is accurate in a way that took me a while to sit with, because factories have always needed power, industrial scale power. And the name turns out to be a better description of the problem than anyone using it seemed to intend. The people who built the electrical grid didn't design it for this. They designed it for a world where demand grew predictably, decade over decade, and where the largest consumers were steel mills and aluminum smelters and the slow accumulation of suburban sprawl. Not server buildings that consume a small city's worth of electricity and appear fully formed in 18 months. What happens when the new economy arrives faster than the infrastructure that was supposed to support it? That is not a rhetorical question. There is a specific technical answer, and it is not the answer that most coverage of this story has been giving. There is a number I want to give you before we go any further. Researchers at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory track every project that applies for permission to connect to the American power grid, generation projects, storage projects, the AI data centers that Nvidia's customers are building right now, every application going back decades, and they publish their findings. Here is what they found. Of all the capacity that applied for grid connection between the years 2000 and 2019, nearly 2 decades of applications, only 13% was actually built by the end of 2024. The rest, the other 87%, stalled, was withdrawn, ran out of money or time, or patience, with a process that moves at a speed that has nothing to do with market demand and everything to do with the physical and regulatory complexity of connecting new load to an existing electrical system. The median time for a project that does make it through, more than 4 years. This is not a future problem. This is the present condition of the infrastructure that Jensen Huang's customers need to turn on the machines they are buying right now. PJM Interconnection, the grid operator managing the largest power market in the United States, published a demand forecast in late 2025 that got some coverage, but probably not enough. Data centers, they said, were expected to account for nearly all projected demand growth on their system through the end of the decade. If supply doesn't rise to meet that demand, they warned of potential shortages as early as 2027. The federal agency that oversees interstate electricity responded in June 2026 by approving an emergency fast-track approval process for PJM's most urgent interconnection requests. When regulators reach for emergency procedures for what was supposed to be routine infrastructure planning, it is worth pausing on that for a moment. Dominion Energy, which serves Northern Virginia's data center concentration, reported contracted data center capacity of nearly 51 gigawatts. These are the facilities he calls AI factories. This is what that name actually requires. The way this situation is usually framed is simple. AI data centers consume too much electricity. The grid can't keep up. Build more generation capacity. That framing is not wrong, but it is incomplete, and the part that's missing changes the nature of the problem entirely. In the summer of 2024, about 60 data centers in Northern Virginia dropped off the power grid at the same moment. A protection event caused them all to disconnect simultaneously. The grid operators on duty had minutes, not hours, to respond. They were suddenly facing a massive, instantaneous surplus of generation with nowhere to go. They called power plants across the system and told them to reduce output immediately, before the imbalance cascaded into a chain reaction collapse across the grid. The Texas grid operator later published an analysis of its own system. It found groups of large data centers and cryptocurrency facilities that could each trigger the sudden loss of enough generation to power a small state under certain fault conditions. Since 2023, the Texas grid operator had identified 26 such events, roughly one every 7 weeks. The industry has spent years asking whether AI will consume enough electricity. The question it has not yet fully asked is whether AI loads are stable enough to be safe neighbors on a grid that was not designed for them. There is one more dimension to this. A survey in June 2026 found that more than 3 in 4 Americans, 77%, worry that AI data centers will raise their electricity bills. More than half said they would oppose a data center being built near them. That is not a fringe position. That is what the country that hosts most of this infrastructure actually thinks. In Ireland, data centers now consume 22% of all metered electricity in the country. There are serious conversations there about whether to keep approving new facilities. What happens in Ireland is a preview of a democratic system deciding it has had enough. So Nvidia is building the most powerful AI hardware in history. Its customers are spending hundreds of billions of dollars to deploy it. And the grid is answering, slowly, technically, and now politically, that it cannot move at the speed being asked of it. What does that cost? And who is actually paying for it? Let me give you a number. In the first quarter of its fiscal year 2027, the months of February through April 2026, Nvidia reported $81.6 billion in revenue, nearly all of it from data centers. To put that in context, Nvidia's annual revenue had grown from $60 billion in fiscal 2024 to over $215 billion in fiscal 2026 selling chips. In a single quarter, it now books more than many countries' largest companies generate in a year. There is another side to that transaction. The companies buying those chips are not simply purchasing hardware. They are committing to build the buildings that house it, the cooling infrastructure that keeps it alive, and the power connections that make any of it run. And when they can't find power fast enough, they are now funding the generation capacity itself. Microsoft announced it was on track to spend $80 billion on AI-enabled data centers in a single fiscal year. That number moved markets when it was announced. Roughly 3 months later, Reuters reported that Microsoft had quietly pulled back from data center projects set to use 2 gigawatts of electricity in the United States and Europe, partly because those projects would not support the AI workloads that had originally justified them. $80 billion committed, the power capacity abandoned. Both things happened in the same reporting period. Meta told its investors it planned to spend between $64 and $72 billion on infrastructure in 2025. Then, in April 2026, it revised that guidance. The new number was nearly double for 2026 alone. The reason given was higher component pricing and extra data center costs. OpenAI's Stargate initiative committed $500 billion over 4 years. The scale of these commitments across the industry reached figures that financial analysts described as historically unusual. Nvidia is getting paid. Everyone else is getting invoiced. The reason is structural. Nvidia's business model produces revenue the moment a chip ships. The infrastructure required to use that chip, the power, the land, the grid connection, produces costs for years before it produces returns. No individual decision maker can resolve that misalignment by choosing differently. The incentive structures are built into the architecture of the industry itself. There is a moment from January 2026 that I keep returning to. Brad Smith, Microsoft's president, published a statement about data centers and the communities near them. He wrote that tech companies must, in his words, pay their own way, that it would be both unfair and politically unrealistic to make the public bear the electricity costs of AI infrastructure. He was right. That position is correct. Reuters then published a separate investigation. They found that at least 40 US states have some version of the same regulatory structure. Utilities are allowed to begin collecting money from their customers before a construction project is complete, to finance grid upgrades by drawing on electricity bills while the work is still being done. A homeowner in Ohio or Virginia opening her utility bill this month may already be paying for infrastructure she has never heard of and cannot opt out of. Brad Smith said tech companies should pay their own way. The regulatory architecture of the American utility system was already moving grid upgrade costs onto customer bills. Both of those things are true simultaneously. And then there is the question of clean energy. Meta has been careful and consistent in how it talks about its new facilities. Its Indiana data center, it says, will match its energy use with clean sources, water-efficient cooling, responsible sourcing. Reuters reported in April 2026 that a utility serving Louisiana is building 7 new gas-fired power plants for Meta-related load. 7 gas plants. The press release says clean energy. The energy contract says 7 gas plants. Both documents are real. Both were signed in the same period. The gap between public language and physical infrastructure is where the actual cost of this transition is hiding. And it is not a small gap. The executives building all of this are not acting in bad faith. That would make this a simpler story. What they are doing is something more interesting, and I think more instructive. They are making rational decisions inside a system that was designed to make those decisions feel rational. And there is a pattern to it I have seen before. It is not specific to AI. It is not specific to Nvidia. It is specific to a certain kind of room. In November 2025, Jensen Huang said this on an earnings call. Blackwell sales are off the charts, and cloud GPUs are sold out. That was the same month PJM published its warning about potential power shortages as early as 2027, 4 months after the largest grid operator in the United States had said, in writing, that it was struggling to keep up with projected demand. In April 2026, Sam Altman wrote that the right response to AI demand was to, his words, build more compute faster. That same month, the Berkeley Lab Q data showed that the median project seeking grid connection takes more than 4 years to reach operation. That over the prior 2 decades, 87% of projects that applied were never built at all. Mark Zuckerberg, in January 2026, spoke about building tens of gigawatts of AI infrastructure this decade. 3 months later, Meta revised its projected spending upward by tens of billions of dollars. The reason given included higher component pricing and costs that came in above projections. The ambition was unchanged. The world pushed back anyway. These are not people who ignored the evidence. They are people who were surrounded, at every point, by evidence that confirmed the direction they were already moving. The market rewarded them for moving faster. Their boards expected it. Their competitors were doing the same thing. That pattern is genuinely difficult to assign to any individual, which is what makes it worth paying attention to. I've spent a long time with these documents, and I keep arriving at the same place. I'm not sure I would have done differently, not because the decisions were good, because the room would have felt the same to me as it felt to them. And the room, in every case, was telling them the truth about demand, about opportunity, about competitive necessity. The room was right about everything except the one variable that wasn't in the room: the grid, the queue, the substation in Virginia. The woman in Ohio opening her utility bill this month, who will not immediately understand why it is higher than it was last year. Those variables don't attend earnings calls. They don't show up in product roadmaps. They move at a different speed entirely, and they have been moving quietly this whole time. The companies I've described are not standing still. Microsoft has signed agreements to restart nuclear generation that was shut down years ago. Meta has committed to nuclear power arrangements measured in gigawatts. Amazon pursued a deal to draw power directly from a nuclear facility. OpenAI has publicly called for accelerating grid infrastructure as a matter of national priority. These are real commitments. The International Energy Agency does not project collapse. It projects serious, concentrated regional strain in the places where this infrastructure is being built fastest. The people closest to the problem know it is a problem. I want to be honest about that before the end. And it is still true that the executives are often directionally right. The investments are real. The ambition is, in many ways, appropriate to the scale of what's being built. And they are still, structurally, moving faster than the physical world can respond. Electrical transformers, the devices that step voltage up and down across the grid, take years to manufacture and deliver. Substations take years to permit. New nuclear power does not appear on demand. A substation cannot be approved, funded, built, and energized on an earnings call timeline. The physical world sets the tempo. It always has. It just hasn't mattered this much to this many people for this long a period in a very long time. In May 2025, Jensen Huang said, AI is essential infrastructure, just like electricity and the internet. He meant it as a statement about importance, about permanence, about how deeply AI was going to embed itself into the structure of modern life. He was right. What he was also describing, without intending to, was a dependency. AI is essential infrastructure, and it runs on electricity, which means that everything constraining electricity now constrains AI. The queue, the permit, the vote of a utility commission in a state that most people in Silicon Valley couldn't find on a map. Nvidia went from making graphics chips to becoming the financial center of the AI era. Its customers went from leasing server space to reviving nuclear reactors, funding gas plants, and fighting over queue positions in a federal interconnection system designed for a different century. Somewhere along the way, without anyone deciding it, the most important question in AI stopped being about algorithms. Can Nvidia keep scaling compute faster than the grid can scale power? What I do know is that the grid has been here longer than Nvidia. It has outlasted every company that ever called itself essential infrastructure. The people paying its bills, in Ohio, in Virginia, in Indiana, in Louisiana, have been there longer than all of them. It has its own pace, its own physics, its own politics. The grid doesn't care about your market cap.